live. So if you go to sorry, let me find it again. If you go to chairmanmendelsohn.com/ECE and you click on the meeting materials folder, you should be able to find it. All right, welcome everybody. It is good to see you all. I feel like I have seen most of you sometime in the last several days. But always good to be together. And we have another action-packed meeting this evening. Let me share my screen. So we are going to, we've got a few things on our agenda for tonight. So the first thing we're going to do is Christina's actually going to give us a little more information about Saturday's roundtable and how that is going to work. What we can all expect, and get a little information from folks about who is going to be able to be there. And then we are going to do some looking at salary scale. So we're going to return to the conversation that we had a couple of sessions ago in the whole task force. In the interim, we've had a working group conversation. So we'll bring back some of what came out of that conversation and continue to move the ball downfield a little bit. And then we'll do the same thing with funding mechanisms, including a couple of specific questions for each of those that the working group started to wrestle with and would like to hear from the broader task force. And then spend a little bit of time looking at some of the benefits cliffs issues that we have talked about a bunch, but we're trying to dig into them a little bit deeper, so have some more information for folks about that. And then we will wrap up. I am going to do my best to kind of move us along through this agenda so that we at least are able to dip into each of these topics. I know that, every one of them we could spend hours on. And so I'm trying to kind of keep us, moving to make some more progress, knowing that, we're not going to tie everything up, obviously, this evening, but hopefully we'll continue to move things forward. With that, I am going to turn it to Christina Setlow to give us a little bit of information about Saturday's roundtable and what we all need to be thinking about.
Thanks, Abigail. So we have about 20 to 30 individuals who have signed up. Thank you for helping to get the word out. We are gathering and putting the witness list together for anybody that is watching that is planning to testify on Saturday. You should be getting correspondence from myself or the committee of the whole email tonight with information on how to register, and you'll need to register that to get your personalized link. For all of the members of the task force who are planning to attend, you should have already received your panelist link. If you did not or cannot find it, please send me an email and I will resend it to you. It is a different link than the link that you usually use for the ECE compensation task force meetings. So you don't use the link that you use tonight. You'll need a different one for the hearing. And again, you should have received that already, but if you didn't or can't find it, let me know. We are going to have translation services available for individuals who are testifying in Spanish and require us to provide English translation. We may not have them for the entire duration of the hearing, but once the individuals, if they need translation and want to watch the entire hearing through, will be able to do so by choosing the interpretation option on the YouTube video once it is posted to the chairman's website. And then I think that's about it. We'll run it, and for those of you who are familiar with council hearings, we'll run it in a similar format. So individuals, the task force members will be able to provide a short opening statement, and then we'll bring in different panels of individuals the task force members will have a set amount of time to ask questions just to keep the hearing moving so that we can keep a flow to it. And then, be able to ask the questions. I think Abigail mentioned this the last meeting. We did put 5 different questions in the roundtable notice that we're asking individuals to speak to. And anybody who is not able to testify, who wants to provide a written statement, can email that statement to www.chairmanmendelson.com/ECE. And we will, that's where you go for information. If you want to email us, though, that is ececompensation@gmail.com. And if you email your written statement to ececompensation@gmail.com, I will make sure to provide that to all the task force members after we get statements for the record.
Perfect. I'm also noticing that Cynthia is in the attendees room.
Just saw her. Yep.
Her in as well. That'd be great. So as Christina said, I think many of us have sat on the other side of the table for hearings, and we in this case are going to be on the listening and questioning side of the table, as it were. If task force members could just let me know whether they are able to attend, and if so, how long you'll be able to stay. Again, if people have things that that they can't move, I understand. We start at 10, and we will go until everyone's had a chance to speak. So so we don't know exactly how long that will be, but could be a few hours. So please just let me know. Just drop me a quick email. If you just letting me know if you're attending, and for how long. Yeah. Thanks, Rakaya. So yeah, depending upon how long it goes. So again, it seems like for the first 2 hours we're set on translation, we think. So if it's going to go beyond that, we will see. We will see what we can do in real time, but at the very least, we'll be able to have an after the fact translation for whatever period's not translated. Okay. Any questions about Saturday?
I guess I'm curious about the format. So I know there were questions that were sent out as prompts. Are folks going to be asked to structure their testimony around those? Or are those going to be asked directly to them? Or is it more like just context for them to structure their testimony?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. I mean, if there are other things that people are particularly, interested in sharing about, then they're certainly welcome to do that. But we wanted to provide some guidance for things that we know would be particularly helpful for us to hear from folks about. And then in the question and answer portion, as each of us is free to ask whatever feels most, useful of panelists. So it might be something specific to what they spoke about, or, we can certainly ask them something outside of that if we think they're going to have, a perspective that's going to be helpful for us. Yeah. And again, we'll share all the written testimony that comes with everybody, so that people have a chance to review that. All right. Any other questions? Excellent. So salary scale. So again, just to remind everybody, we delved into this issue 2 meetings ago, I think, yes, of the whole task force. And then since then, a working group that included Cynthia, Kathy, Marika, Marla, Sally, and Sarah came together to dive a little more specifically into the salary scale piece. So I'm going to go through some of what came out of that conversation in terms of just some big picture kind of principles or priorities that that the working group developed, and then we're going to get a little bit more into detail on what a draft salary scale could look like, given the additional input and feedback. And then want to open it up to everybody to react to this. So the big picture that came out of our conversation, there's sort of two big principles. One, keep it simple. That was a generally agreed upon priority, that a relatively simple salary scale that's really clear is going to make it easier for both the educators and their employers to have a consistent understanding of what is required in order for employers to execute the scale accurately and fairly, and also for monitoring and compliance to make sure that there's accountability. So given that, there were a few things that the working group focused on. One, focusing on baseline salaries by role and credential rather than a more complex step system, and we'll look at what that might look like. Limit the number of credential levels so we could have, like, not infinite, but we could have a whole bunch of different levels, and again, for simplicity's sake, want to limit that to a relatively small number. That we should have an expectation about annual COLAs, and there were some specific ideas about how we can standardize that. And just the concept that in instituting a new salary scale, we don't want a situation where somebody's salary goes down as a result of the new scale. So in addition to keeping it simple, there was a priority on allowing for flexibility beyond those basics. So while those basic expectations should be consistent across all of the participating facilities, individual facilities, centers, or homes might choose to develop more nuanced or robust salary scales that go beyond those basics, and that could be for a number of reasons and could have a number of different elements. But task force members talked about recruitment and retention incentives, internal career ladders, leveraging additional resources that you might have access to. But within that flexibility, we want to, one, provide guidance and TA, technical assistance, for programs that might use some support in developing those scales. So some people are going to be more equipped to do that than others, and we want to be able to provide some of that support. And then ensuring that there are safeguards against passing additional costs to families beyond whatever the established limits are. So those are a couple of big picture things. Let me walk through these next couple of slides, but again, keep track. If you have reactions or questions about this, feel free to drop in the chat or just jot them down. So this is just what we saw 2 meetings ago. So this is an excerpt from the hypothetical compensation scale model that ECE put together. And I just wanted to remind us of what was on here. So this is just a portion of it. So there are three credential levels that are listed here, but there are actually additional ones in the draft. And it has a step, step levels that go all the way through like step 15 or something. One of the things that we did in sort of trying to move things forward is look at what other inputs are there that might be helpful in informing where we set levels for this salary scale. And one of those is the cost assumptions of ECE's cost of care model, which actually assume some higher salaries than what is contemplated in the ECE hypothetical salary scale. So that was one input that felt important to take into account. And then there's some other information that we were able to gather, both from some providers, also from some of the market research that ASI has access to. So in looking through that, there were a couple things that I think became kind of came to the fore. What you see here is a draft for discussion of what would be a salary scale that focuses on that minimum salary as, the floor, looks at the eligible roles of assistant teacher and teacher. And again, remember, when we're saying assistant teacher, that includes the titles that exist in child development homes as well as centers, and some of those titles look a little different, but the equivalent of the lead educator in the classroom as the teacher and supporting educator, assistant teacher. And it has, in each of those roles, it has 3 credential levels. I'm gonna go to a version of this exact same scale that has that's annotated. But so that one was a little easier on the eyes. This one's a little more complex in terms of information, but it's the same numbers. So I want to just talk through what this is and what it reflects in terms of some of the principles that the working group talked about. So what you see in the red text is credentialing requirements as of December 2023. So those are those credentialing requirements that we all know we're working towards. But in the meantime, they're not, that's not, we aren't there yet. But you see that reflected, just to give you a sense of who might be what's the profile of educator who's in each of those categories. And then the green shows assumptions for arriving at each of the levels, dollar amount. And what you see is, the annual salary is assuming, 12-month full-time employees, and the hourly from there. So if you look at the green, you see at the top here, the highest number on the salary scale, we have that parity with DCPS BA. And then at the associate level, 85% of that. At the CDA level, 85% of the associate level. So that's the math that got to these numbers. If you look at the assistant teacher role, what you see is the associate level here is at the same level salary-wise as the CDA level for teacher. So the idea being that the first priority is on role, but then the next on credential. So this would be, someone who does not, that associate degree goes beyond the requirement for that role, even as of December 2023. But the notion would be that if you are still in that assistant teacher role, you don't bump up to what that associate's degree would get you at the teacher role, because that's not the role that you're in. But there's some additional recognition of moving to that point, similar to what Kelly Sally shared with us a couple of sessions ago about her situation where she was an assistant teacher. There wasn't a lead teacher role yet. She got something from her center to acknowledge that, but it wasn't until she moved into the new role that she fully got that salary. Okay, so I think that's enough narration about this. So let me stop there, and I want to open it up both to anyone who was part of the conversation. Oh, I guess one other thing I should note that is significant is these numbers are, with the exception of the BA number, are notably higher than those step 1 numbers in the salary scale that OSCE developed as, as part of that report for the birth to three requirement that they did. So I want to note that. And what that means, among other things, is that even the less than CDA level that's here for the assistant teacher is notably higher than what the parity number is for a DCPS aid is the title.
I get some food when you have a chance. Something that's easy to eat and not messy.
We're doing some good parenting there, Christina, but I just muted you.
Sorry.
It's all good. We're all about childcare. So I think those are I think that's enough voiceover for this. So I want to open it up to, again, anyone who is part of that working group that wants to to add any color to some of the big picture things that I shared here, but also to anyone who has questions or comments on what you see in this draft. And I want to emphasize this is still a draft salary scale that focuses on that minimum salary. So let me open the floor.
Can I ask a clarifying question? I wasn't part of the group. So this is only salary and wages, right? This does not take into account any sort of benefits or fringe or other compensation, right?
Correct. This is specifically salary.
Thank you.
So I guess I was part of the group, but in talking with folks post that meeting and just kind of, sitting here and listening to things, I have, I guess, 3 questions. I guess the first one is, if keeping it simple, and I think, keeping it simple is great in concept because it, the more bits and pieces you add can get very confusing, but does keeping it simple meet the requirement in the birth to 3 law, where what the task is and what our charge is? The second question I have, and I know we haven't decided this, but if we decide that there's a baseline amount that programs that employers are responsible for putting towards salaries, and then the rest would be supplemental funding. If we're talking about having a nuanced approach with different programs, how do we support kind of this nuanced, if somebody says, I'm going to pay my teacher, $100,000, are we going to supplement to reach that $100,000 because we're allowing this kind of flexibility for individual programs? And then the final question is, does having a simple scale like this potentially penalize educators with, long tenure in this field? If we give this out and then programs say, well, I've got the flexibility to create my own scale, I know there's going to be the caveat that nobody should be penalized and their salary shouldn't go down, but are they going to be stagnated? Is is a program going to potentially put a cap on somebody's salary because they've been given this flexibility?
So yeah, Marla. Oh, you're on mute.
I'm looking at this and then I'm thinking about how to operationalize it. And so, Sally, I think it could possibly get at what your some of the issues are. Just for a working basis, let's go with 3% COLA every year. So if I were to get the base salary of a bachelor's teacher, ECE, with $66,000, then, and let's say that teacher has 5 years, I would probably do a multiplier of 0.15 or 1.15, which would bring me to 76, thinking that's where I need to pay that teacher to control for and honor their experience. So, and that's at 3%. And I'm not saying 3% needs to be the number of the COLA, but I'm just thinking about what I always try to have as a COLA. Then if we think about that, then there could be a way that we say this is the base and we're going to reimburse a center up to the COLA times the years of experience up to 10 years, because I think that's where DCPS or whatever we decide. I mean, however we want to do that. And so therefore, there is some type of constraints around it. And then there's a mechanism to support the salary beyond the bachelor's degree. So yeah, I don't think you could pay somebody who's just starting the same amount that has been in the field for a while, and I don't think we should. I think we need to honor that experience. But if I was going to create steps for myself, I would probably kind of step them out in that way, in that manner, so that I would have a way of budgeting for this year and future years.
I like I like the idea of what you're describing, Marla, in the sense of I think that was my first pain point in looking at this, is like I like it as a starting point, and where it's hard to think about is recognizing that experience. So like, what is a mechanism that we could incorporate that gives programs flexibility to honor the experience, that doesn't require as much data check? I think that's the hard part, is as I'm thinking about it, I'm like, how do you verify someone's experience if they have 15 years, if they have 11 years? That can look really different for different educators, and it's all really valuable experience. And at the same time, just in terms of the labor of validating that as a teacher, and also on the other side of administering it, trying to like keep track of all that information and what counts as like acceptable documentation and things like that. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I like your idea, Marla, and what I'm trying to think about is there a way to reduce oversight and create some sort of discretionary allowance for honoring those things within the providers, and within the provider themselves. So that's what I'm curious about.
Cynthia, and then I'm gonna pick on you, Marika, because I feel like you spoke about this in our working group in terms of thinking about how the market works, and so if you're willing to share some of your perspective on this, I think it would be helpful for folks. Cynthia.
Basically, I just wanted to say that ways that we can verify staff's information is because when people are hired, that's what referrals are for. They have other previous employment that we can tap into. And if they can provide that documentation, like Rakaya said, I guess that's the way you can check someone's experience.
Thanks, Cynthia.
So I have a question. So this salary scale is going to be used for compensation to give teachers and assistant teachers the difference between what they get paid and what the salary scale is, regardless of how much they make in the different scenarios, because obviously in childcare, it's a lot ratios. So when you have younger children and 8 children to 2, or the older the children, the more funds you get to probably compensate the teacher's salary between infants and toddlers. And I'm just curious.
So one of the things that, and, you know, we've had this tension in each of our conversations. Part of the answer to your question and, well, this whole conversation is about the delivery mechanism, right? So, so for what it's worth, and this is, you know, a little out of order, but the way this is laid out is making an assumption at some level that there is the kind of delivery mechanism, long-term delivery mechanism that we talked about last time, and that we'll get into a little more detail on shortly, but where there would be program level funding that essentially is operating dollars for a program that is delivered through some magic formula that we're going to figure out, right? That, so, you know, we don't know the answer to that exactly yet, but the idea being that you're looking at what would the cost be to run a program that pays these salaries, essentially, and then you're taking into account a range of revenue sources that facilities have, right? So if you accept subsidy, that's a source. Whatever your parent fees are, understanding that we want limitations around that, that's a source. You know, if you are part of, you know, Head Start or early, I mean, they're all different kinds of funding, right? That programs get. This would be a portion of that, and the idea would be that, in theory, we want it to be enough so that each of the participating programs is able to, within the means that they have, meet those salaries. And then in terms of what happens beyond that, there are other market forces that can be in play. So it's not, so in answer to your question, I don't think that there is a scenario in which we're, you know, collecting exact salary information on 4,000 educators and then mapping it against all of these different factors and then, you know, writing a check for the exact difference, right? Like that's not probably a workable model. I'm watching Sarah, you know, try to like not blanch at the idea. But in concept, it's a funding that would allow programs to be able to meet these levels. Yeah, I don't know if that responds to your question. I see Sarah with a hand up, and then Marika, and Cynthia and Marla. I don't know if those are old hands or new hands.
Old hands for me.
Okay,
I'm gonna minimize it.
Okay. So Sarah, Marika.
Thanks, Abby. And I think you actually said one of the things that was on my mind, which is, you know, I loved the thought process that Dr. Dean laid out about how you would think about using the salary schedule in your program. But I did note that there's a very big difference between you in a program, or as Ms. Davis was mentioning, you know, looking at referrals and other things to look at somebody's experience, doing that in a program versus trying to design a system that enables ECE to do those calculations at an individual level for 4,500 educators and then translate that into numbers that translate to payments to childcare providers. That is possible, but it's a very complicated undertaking. And I think the complexity might actually, for providers in receiving the funds, also be a challenge, because we have a lot of systems right now that are quite complicated. The other thing I just wanted to note, though, is one thing that is really exciting to me about the way we're talking about this is we know from national research and some of the salary information we've seen from programs in the district that often, even in the same program, infants and toddler teachers are paid less than preschool teachers, and that even setting aside the public funding for our pre-K program. And one thing I think is just really powerful about this is that it doesn't differentiate between infant and toddler teachers and preschool teachers, that it tries to set a baseline for everybody, regardless of age, that is the same, with that bachelor's degree level keyed to the DCPS entry level of the salary scale for that level. And I do think that has implications for how, at the provider level, providers might need to make decisions about how to use money if where infant and toddler teachers are now is paid at a lower level than where their preschool teachers are, which is, you know, to all the questions people are asking, something to navigate. But I just want to say, from a sort of goals we're trying to accomplish, the fact that we are not differentiating by age is a very important thing about the salary schedule.
And I would add to that, Sarah, not differentiating by age and not differentiating by setting. In other words, home versus center. Marika.
Abigail, you're right. So I thought about how to operationalize the fact that there isn't a differential, and I fully support that there isn't one. But when you think about the number of children in a classroom, in a pre-K classroom, you have a potential for more parents to pay into a classroom, if you want to think about it that way, like 16 versus 8, or other sources to pay into a classroom. So I'm wondering if not the pay is made different, but do we give some type of way to make it feasible to pay those salaries in an infant and toddler setting? Like the differential from us is a little different to help. And I'm thinking out loud, but I'm trying to think like, cost that out in real time. If you have 8 children, parents pay no more than 10% of their income or whatever which we're trying to get to, and then when you cost all of those models out, does it require that maybe we say we pay this amount for pre-K and this amount to programs for infant and toddler to make that math work?
I think that's a great question to think about, Dr. Dean, as we think about designing a potential funding formula, which I think if we do a distribution of providers, we would need to do. One of the things that we are working on OSCE's side to help inform that, because I don't think we will get to a provider level funding formula in this process, is we will engage the national cost modeling experts who've advised us on cost modeling in the past to help us do some assessment of what the implications of wherever the committee lands for a provider's per classroom costs and then for system level costs are. And I think that kind of analysis could help us get at the question you're asking in terms of what a funding formula would actually support providers to do this could look like.
Thank you, because I mean, in short, crude math, if you have 16 kids in a classroom and each family is paying, let's say, $2,000, and then so that's $32,000 that can help feed into that teacher's salary or that classroom salary, because you probably have more than one teacher in there, versus with that same situation of $2,000 per family paying over the course of a year. With 8 families, that's only $16,000. So how do you make the math work? Because we don't want a differential between infant and toddler teachers and pre-K teachers. So I just think it's something to bring up to make the math work.
I think it's such an important point, Marla. And I think as we think about all of the different factors that need to go into that cost modeling, this one feels important. And there are a whole bunch, right? So when we're thinking both about costs and revenue sources that do look different based on age level because of the way in which care is delivered differently, right? So I think it's important to consider that. And I had another specific thought about it that just disappeared, but it'll come back to me. So yes, I think duly noted, and I will. We're going to talk about some of those next steps in terms of some of the work that OSCE is doing at the end of the meeting, but we should add this as one of the specifics.
Hey, Abby, can I say one thing in response to a question Cynthia asked in the chat that I think is actually a great question? So Cynthia asked if DCPS pays separately based on the age of children instead of education level. And my understanding is that the DCPS salary schedule is not differentiated by age of the child, but in the uniform per student funding formula that determines how much money a school gets per child, there is a difference where pre-K3 classrooms get more than pre-K4 classrooms because of analysis of the costs that has been done. And I think we could use our cost model to do something somewhat similar to help inform thinking about some of these questions, including thinking about what this means in a home context, obviously.
100%.
Yeah, and one more comment, if I may. I mean, because if I'm not mistaken, it also subsidy pay less money for home education, home-based education than centers. And so, you know, I think that also needs to be taken in consideration when, you know, you want to parity of pay for the home centers or education centers that get less funds.
Thanks, Christina. Marika, I like put you up to talking and then I haven't let you talk.
That's okay. Yeah, I mean, I think as we're having this conversation, we're having a linear conversation, but the decisions are clearly intersectional. And it's kind of hard to have the conversation about establishing only a baseline with sort of some annual increase versus scales without unpacking sort of this magic award formula. I think just like programs administrators are able to establish tuition based on multiple factors, including market rate, it is highly likely that depending on the formula for compensation, they will also be able to create their own salary scales based on what the market, based on the market. Certainly additional technical assistance will be helpful. I'm not minimizing the need for technical assistance, but let's also honor the business competencies that providers have been able to demonstrate. So I think the award formula, I don't know if that's a decision we can kick down the road as part of this process. I think we're going to have to identify one, or else it makes the salary scales conversation really complicated. There are other pieces about this slide that I just want to point out for needs additional conversations or attention. The inclusion of the pre-ECE one of the aid or floater. I know DC, the facility regulations sometimes associates aides and volunteers. I'm curious about why it was included. And
yeah,
how many.
it's just included to show the baseline of the living wage, which is what that the first level. I'm pointing on my screen so that you can see me pointing, but you can't. The assistant teacher less than a CDA is just pegged to 25% above that. So these roles are not eligible based on what we've talked about to date. So again, we could change our mind, but that's where we are. It's the assistant teacher and teachers, but it's just pegged to that as the base.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. As well as the multiple levels for teacher assistants.
So yeah, so great question. So and I would love people's thoughts on this in terms of the credential levels for each. So the credential levels for the assistant, the CDA, again, is that credential that we're shooting for everybody to get to, which would then be the baseline credential. But for right now, that's not yet a requirement. And we're going to have to, ask ourselves questions about even when the deadline kicks in, what happened, what happens at that point. And that's a whole separate conversation, but one that will need to happen probably. So at the very least for now, there is a need to identify a level below the CDA because we have a lot of folks who are in that. So that explains that one. So that might go away once we hit the deadline. The associate degree one, I would love people's thoughts on this because there were some differences of opinion on this one. So one argument is to say CDA is that requirement for that role. If you earn an associate's degree and at some point then that allows you to meet the requirement for being a lead teacher, there's certain lead teacher roles that require that AA. and maybe you just, you stay at this level with your COLAs until a job opens up that you get there. So that's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is if you are in this assistant teacher role, you get that degree that's beyond, that associate's degree that's beyond what's required of you, but you're pursuing your education further. What this proposed draft does is say you get acknowledged for that whilst continuing to be an assistant teacher by an increase. It's not a huge increase, but it's an increase. But it's nothing like the increase that you would get if you did move into that lead teacher role at that credential level. So the idea being that if you're trying to build that career ladder, you're encouraging your assistant teachers to consider getting further education and moving into some of those other roles. It gives them some financial incentive of doing that even before they move into that role. So that's the rationale for it. I'd love to hear people's thoughts about whether that makes sense. If so, do these differentials, the dollar differentials, feel right? If not, why not?
Hi, this is Cynthia. I think I raised my hand. I don't know if anybody else has some other hands up.
Oh, yes. Sorry. Go ahead, Cynthia.
Oh, okay. What I don't want to really happen is that I know we want to have that piece if that position doesn't open up, but in homes, if a teacher decides to get the associate degree, what would be great, that if a person decided that they wanted to move up, I don't want to make them stay in that position because if another position is not available. We should have that wiggle room to be able to increase slowly, right? Hopefully that's where we're going. Is that what you just stated? Or I just want to make sure I understand that.
So yeah, so this would give them a raise, again, like a notable raise, not a huge raise, but a notable raise for getting that additional degree. And then you would, again, have COLAs of some sort that would, allow people to continue to get higher wages. I think that, I think you're raising an important point that obviously the room to move into other roles is just different in homes because, they're not a whole lot of slots, right? Unless someone puts you out the door, Cynthia. So I do think that there potentially are more ceilings, as in any, in any industry, right? If you're working somewhere with very few employees, then there's less room for growth, and that's, that there's some reality there. So I don't want to pretend that, that just goes away, but this would at least give some room for that within the scale.
But I just want to make sure that if I wanted to have a second lead teacher beside myself, I don't want that person not to be able to have that level of growth, whether I'm small or not. It won't be at a level that centers are at in other large facilities, but I still want that wiggle room for them to have that level of growth to be in that lead teacher. If that's what I choose to decide as a business owner, I not only myself, but as another person can be a lead teacher in the same facility. I can have two. I'm saying I don't have to have one lead teacher because I'm a home, or one technical assistant, or one administrative assistant. If I choose to have 3 lead teachers and they have their credentials, I want that to be, because it will not be the same still in larger facilities.
Yeah.
Because I want that experience in my program.
Yeah.
And that education level.
Yep.
Sorry.
Yep. Totally hear that. And obviously at some point, with any facility, to be clear, we're not going to be in a situation of saying, let us know how many teachers you feel like having, right? I mean, and I know you're not suggesting that, Cynthia, but there would need to be some sort of formula, again, that takes into account enrollment and capacity and certainly some of the other factors that that Marla raised, that costs might look different based on age, et cetera. But within that context, I think giving people room to be able to honor the additional education and experience, again, to a point, I think that's the idea here.
Okay, I just want to make sure that I note that it's not based on my feelings. It's based on a business move that will be appropriate for my business. Yeah. My feelings have nothing to do with the question.
Marika.
Yeah, so the two other points, and I do agree. I think again, which is why it's important to have this conversation with the formula, because I think in many ways the formula should be agnostic, not only to setting, as we talked about, or age of children, but also the staff and structure. If a program wants to hire only bachelor's degree lead teachers in every classroom, or 2 bachelor's degree lead teachers in every classroom, they can do that. Like, let's just allow some flexibility for multiple innovative staff and structures. Just the 2 other points, I think when we're talking and making comparisons to the DCPS salaries, it will be helpful to indicate what step in the DCPS we're referring to when we say salary here is higher than DCPS, because I think in most cases when we're saying that the salaries here are higher than DCPS, we're talking about DCPS step 1.
That's correct. That's correct. So with the idea that, DCPS step 1 is, a new teacher who comes with no experience is at step 1. And so, that was the sort of parity comparison. But given what we're talking about here, where that we want to be able to provide that flexibility for programs, and where frankly the specificity of some of the experience stuff is as we talked about, just much harder to sort of centrally define and determine, and we might not even want to do that centrally, hence the higher numbers than step 1.
Yeah.
Abby, I think we're saying that it's higher, that we're comparing to step 1 at the bachelor's degree level teachers, but there are other ways where the assistant teacher numbers are higher than the assistant teacher scale we looked at in DCPS beyond just step 1 because of the way that scale is designed.
Right. I think that's what Marika's saying. So when it says it's higher than DCPS parity, the point is it's higher than parity with step 1.
Yeah. I'm. It's an assumption, but I just want us to be clear about like what step when we're putting the DCPS, and I'll encourage us to perhaps look beyond the DCPS step 1 with this scale for multiple reasons, including the fact that we haven't had a conversation about benefits yet, and so while we may have salary parity, we may not have benefits parity. We should make the case for why we should go to a higher step in DCPS when we're making comparisons.
Yeah, totally. And so to be clear, and sorry, I feel like I'm not being clear, but we do go well above that step 1 with for everything except for the bachelor's degree is the only one that has that parity with, to the extent that the scales are comparable, because obviously the degrees aren't all comparable, but where there's a comparable role and degree, which is basically at the assistant teacher level and at the bachelor's level for teachers.
Yeah, all I'm saying is just, can you just, whenever we're referring to the DCPS scale, let's just name the step we're referring to, because it looks as if that's all. And again, it may all be step 1 across the board, but it's just helpful. And then just the last piece, and this is going a bit in the weeds here, but just to review the decisions we're making or assumptions we're making about credential equivalency. For example, that the CDA, it's kind of comparable to 48 credit hours, and which is about 15 in ECE. Like, we just might have just look at all of them across the board again.
Yeah, and again, on those are just coming straight from the existing ECE credential requirements. So, where there are issues there, like, again, that probably deserves a conversation, but maybe outside of this scope.
Yeah, but it may be important to note that, because in many ways, I'm comfortable with the notion that there are some decisions that are pretty much hardwired because we're using an existing formula, an existing definition. But I think where there is room to expand, go beyond the limitations of or confusion of existing regulations, it may be helpful just to name that versus being so wedded to it and as if it's a carved in stone and can be altered.
Yeah.
Abigail, and to that point, I was kind of just doing a comparative analysis between the DCPS scale, looking at that baseline, thinking about a 2 to 3% COLA per year of experience, and looking at that, looking at a step 5. Now, mind you, they're in contract negotiations, and so this is a little old, but for them, it's 72,688. And one of the things I do want, because I looked at the highest category, because in terms of infant and toddler care and pre-K, our teachers work longer school years. And so
this is all adjusted for that. So these numbers are for 12 months.
Yep. And so I would want to do more analysis to see if we kind of consistently over the different years stay in parity or to DCPS, looking at that 3% COLA for each year of, of experience. And a rough estimate and sketch of it does seem to keep it in step with it. Now, there are some times where you get to certain levels where DCPS has a significant bump up, that there may be some discrepancy there.
Thanks. So I want to see if there are any other thoughts on this question around, whether having the associate degree level for assistant teacher makes sense, whether these differentials feel like they make sense from sort of a career ladder perspective. So I want to just see if there are any more comments on this before we move into our next topic. And Rakaya.
Yeah, I raised my hand before you asked that question, just to just ask or make a note on a specific thing. And we don't have to spend time discussing it now, but maybe I just want for us to come back to it at some point. And it is maybe some clarity, and I can go back and take a look at the ECE compensation study. But the question that I wanted to ask is, if I remember correctly in my reading, the 12-month scale wasn't 20% higher than the 10-month scale, and it was less than 20% higher than the 10-month scale, which I think for me raises the question of what is built into the assumption of like those extra months being less valuable or like bringing in less income. Is that because there's an expectation at DCPS that if you're working a 12-month scale that you have different roles during those additional 2 months? So I just wanted to raise that for us to come back to at some point, because I want to make sure that we're representing the fact that in what early learning roles look like throughout the year compared to what a P to 12 role might look like in a public school throughout the year. Just to make sure that we're really we're making sure that that's really leveled out.
Thanks, Rakai. Important point noted, and we should go back and look at that. All right. Marika and Marla, are those old hands?
Old.
Okay. Okay, so let's I feel like the comments around here feel to me at more the sort of detail level than the like big picture level. Like it feels like big picture as a general prospect, this feels like the right direction. If I am getting that wrong, please tell me. We obviously have lots of those specific questions now to dig into, which we can do in our next round. Okay, so let's move to, do people
Abby,
need
can I just go back to one point on the assistant salary scale in particular, to that conversation about step 1? The CDA and associate's degree levels here are actually higher than the highest step on the assistant teacher scale for DCPS. So I wanted to just point that out since we had a conversation about that.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And I will, to that point, I want to just make sure we're being cognizant of the parity language and discussion, because DCPS might come back to us and say, wait a second, like you're blowing us out of the water here because these, are way higher. Now we think if we think these are the right numbers, we should recommend them. But I want us to be a little cognizant of not tying ourselves too much to the parity mast if we in fact are going beyond parity in some of our recommendations, which again, I think is very defensible, but it's just sort of a caution to us. Do people need a 2-minute bio or stretch break?
Can I just say, I think we do, but I want an instructional aid job in the K-12 situation is very different than assistant teacher in a.
Yep. I'm not saying it's not.
No, I know.
Arguable.
I'm arguing that if they're being paid a little bit more, I would argue that they actually have more responsibility. So I support them being paid more.
Yeah, I think it's totally a fair point. I just want to, again, like we're going to have to, like, we can't totally pick and choose our, so, but yes, I agree. All right, let's take a 3-minute, I've got 7:12. Let's take a 3-minute stretch and bio break and we'll get into this next topic at 7:15. All right, folks. I know that was an embarrassingly short break. give people a chance to get back to their computers. Okay, and I thank you for these comments in the chat. Yeah, I think Rakaya talked about figuring out a trigger for keeping pace with the changing DCPS scale. All right, so let's now get into this funding mechanisms conversation. Again, as Marika so eloquently put it, we're having a linear conversation, but these things all intersect. So we're just gonna keep going back and forth. And I know it's you know, it's a little confusing, but we'll try and keep it straight as we go. So this was a particularly popular topic, so we were able to have two different groups engaging on the funding mechanisms. So thank you to all of you who are part of one of those conversations. So just to review, this is all straight from our last meeting. So this should all look super familiar. But as we were thinking about the considerations for what funding mechanisms should look like, we had these big three categories around stability and predictability, timeline, and administrative burden. So that was, you want to sort of keep those in mind. And then similarly, this is also straight from last meeting, but looking at these three basic buckets of potential models with a direct to individuals through childcare facilities through an intermediary, understanding that, you know, these are not totally bright lines. So as you recall, in our last conversation, we came out with, if not consensus, largely coalescing around the approach of going through childcare facilities as the long-term option, given that it builds in more stability, it grows capacity of, you know, of the market generally, but that given what it's going to take to put that in place, that there was a need for a short-term, there's likely a need for a short-term option. And so the idea that we came to in our last meeting, again, general agreement around the idea of the direct to individuals option probably being the most viable in the immediate term. So that's where we last left when we were all together. So going into our conversation with the working group, here are the sort of list of questions that we started with. I will be honest, we did not get to all of these, as you might imagine, but we did start to chip away at them. And thinking about, for the short-term mechanism, one question around whether we would do that as a flat stipend or differentiated in some way. So I'm going to ask people for some input on that in just a moment. And then how do we think about leveraging the short-term option to put us in a better place to be able to effectively implement the longer-term option? What capacity needs would we have? What are the anticipated administrative costs? Most of those questions then also apply for the long-term mechanisms, certainly in terms of anticipated costs and what capacity we need. And then thinking about what expectations would accompany funds beyond the basic salary expectations. We've talked today about some of the other things that we would want to think about in terms of the formula, which we'll get to in a minute. So, big picture, there were some things that came out of our conversation that I think, again, there was general agreement around. One is that while I think people recognize the practical needs for potentially doing a short-term and a long-term, there was a lot of discussion in both groups about how that is likely to be confusing and that we're going to need to really be thoughtful about how we engage the early educator community early on to explain what the different mechanisms are, why we're doing it this way, and set clear expectations so that we don't end up making people frustrated. Any mechanism is going to require TAN support, although it's going to look different depending upon the mechanism. So when we're talking about a direct to educator, for example, we would need to put in some supports to make sure that the educators themselves have what they need to be able to initiate whatever the process is. We're going to need to have supports for providers to do any verification, et cetera. So that is going to require certain kinds of TA. Certainly a long-term mechanism would as well. And that we really want to be very intentional about that at the front end. What is going to make this successful, and how do we build that in whatever we design? There are a number of important equity considerations that that folks named, and that we again want to keep at the fore and really be able to focus on. So among them, there is question around, it's an ongoing thing to think about around access to credentialing programs. And so, Sarah has shared with us that there's been a lot of progress on that in terms of the CDA level in particular, but wanting to make sure that we keep an eye on that. And if there's certain subgroups for whom that access is more problematic and that creates certain systemic inequities, we want to pay attention to that and figure out how we can mitigate it. Similarly, there were some equity related questions around what a formula might end up looking like, and whether we want to take into account poverty level of the community, for example, with some sort of equity index, the social vulnerability index concept that we've seen in other places. So again, just keeping that in mind. And then finally, being really intentional about how we leverage the short-term option to gather data for further compensation work. So some of that is around just making sure we have better status quo data on wages than we have now, because it's somewhat spotty. But also thinking about benefits and how we pull together information that's going to help us to better deliver on this down the line. So some big picture things. So a couple of questions that I would love to engage this group on, that there was some discussion in at least one, if not both of those working groups, but there's some different opinions. So first question, thinking about it again, a direct to educator model, which we're talking about as a potential short-term model. There's a question around, should the payments be flat payments, or should they be differentiated based on role and credential? So this is just an illustrative example of what a tiered model might look like, which recognizes different roles, the teacher and assistant teacher role, and the credential that folks have. It adds obviously a level of complication. It's less simple. It requires some more management on the one hand, and on the other hand, it from a the sort of philosophical level that we've talked about honoring people's credential and role, it does that. An alternative approach would be something like a flat stipend to all eligible folks, regardless of role and credential. So let me stop on that question. I would love to hear perspectives from folks, again, both on the philosophical and the practical levels of how you think we should be thinking about this. Taryn. Oh, sorry, Walrick was first. You're in the corner there of my screen. Walrick and then Taryn.
That's all right. I just wanted to check on this one. As you were going through the the tiering, right? And I think the last statement you made was like making sure that you're honoring the credential. But I also remember in the conversation that Rakia, you had mentioned that there are challenges with actually identifying or verifying like what the right credential is. And I just want to make sure that that I actually heard what you were saying correctly. Like that is an issue where you will have folks that actually have the credential, but being able to prove that they have it. Did I misunderstand that? Or is that in fact what you were getting at?
Are you talking about the conversation we had on Tuesday?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, I think what I was speaking to was that there have been systemic barriers to some groups to accessing some types of credentialing or education. And so what I was saying is, I think especially in this first year, and especially before we have, if OSCE has pushed back the credentialing deadlines because of some of these barriers, I think that in this first year when we're doing a stipend, that, honestly, I don't see, it doesn't seem reasonable to me to include a tiering. And that was kind of my main argument. I think we're all here because we want to see a really thoughtful long-term approach that is honoring people's work and their experience and their learning. And at the same time, this is a short-term approach that is not gonna mirror the final long-term program, because at this point we just don't know what that's going to look like, and we're not going to know it to the nuance needed to not create confusion next year when we're saying, oh yeah, well, we honored your experience in credentials with $19,000 last year, and this year we're going to honor your experience in credentials with a $3,000 raise from your original salary. So if I'm not clear, I'm happy to clarify, but for me I think it will create more confusion, and I also think that it ignores some of the kind of systemic challenges that some folks are facing. And honestly, I think the one thing that I will add, and I know I'm making multiple arguments about this, but I feel strongly about it, is that, we are in a moment where we're emerging from a pandemic. Yes, we are trying to create this long-term equitable system, but at the same time, we're emerging from a pandemic where everyone's been struggling, everyone's been underpaid. And so, in terms of narrative, as we're trying to think about not creating confusion, this pandemic is not really a benefit to anyone, but in this moment, it's kind of a benefit because it creates a really clear narrative point where we can say, hey, we could call this heroes pay, we could call it something like that, give everyone a flat thing to kind of honor the work that they've done this past year, because everyone has struggled. And that way it's a very narratively different than a compensation program that kickstarts off the year. It's going to require hard work, but to keep that narrative separate. But anyways, all that's to say, there are like many layers of why I think a flat stipend makes sense, which are not all the things that you asked about, Walrick. But the starting point for me was about equity in terms of access to the credentialing, and the fact that it's just a 1 year. We're not trying to create a long-term program right now. So why complicate it?
I just have one quick follow-up, and Abigail, I don't know if you actually mentioned it, but if with respect to the alternative approach, do we is that in the realm of possibilities given the remit of like what the funds are supposed to be for, right? If it's towards equitable compensation, is that like a perfectly viable option, or are there additional checks that we would need to make on that model specifically, like the idea of heroes pay?
Yeah, no, it's a fair question. And, I think my instinct on that, and we have among the attendees, I know watching this, a bunch of council staff who may have opinions about this, but my sense is that if this group felt strongly that was the way to go for whatever reasons and put that in recommendations, I think the council would seriously consider it. It's not given that it is the short term. So you're absolutely right that it does not speak to the expectation around differentiating by role and credential. And so, in that way, that doesn't meet the charge. But I suspect that if this group really felt strongly, that we could probably make a good argument. Taryn, Marika, Kathy.
Sure.
Down Walrick? Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Rakira makes a good point about equity and credentialing too. I was thinking more through the logistics of how this would happen. Who would report teachers' roles, and at what point in time, and would the bonuses or stipend, whatever they're called, be prorated across the year, so that we want to encourage people to enter the childcare field too, right? So if somebody enters in June, would they get half of a stipend, or is it allotted all at once? And then how does OSSI keep track if somebody then is promoted halfway through the year? What kind of stipend do they get if they're differentiated by roles, right? I'm just thinking through the kind of complicated logistics and data points that would have to be figured out. I'm not necessarily saying it's impossible. It requires a lot of careful data collection and thinking through.
Yeah, fair point. Marika.
Yeah, I think that it would be helpful. I think there's this assumption that the option where we provide funding directly to the program is the more complicated, the more long-term option, and that this option is sort of a short-term option. And I think it will be helpful just to understand the rationale behind that. I think we certainly trust how we got to that point, but it just may be helpful for us to sort of unpack that for a minute, and all of the assumptions that went into that type of assessment. Because I think it seems to be invisible at this point, at least to me. And around if indeed the short-term direct to educator payment is what we're proposing, it is also helpful to, is this a one-time payment? Is it a retroactive payment? Just curious about that, or maybe we haven't gotten that far yet into the weeds.
Yeah, I would say we, on that last one, I don't think we've gotten that far, although I've got another question for you all that gets a little bit of that. On your first question, I think I don't know, Sarah, if you want to speak a little bit to the sort of level of complexity of the program funding option versus this, and the ways in which it feels less viable short term.
I can talk a little bit about that. I think anytime you are trying to direct money through one party who isn't a direct contractor to distribute the money to another entity and preserve a trail of where that money goes that has accountability, is going to be a more complicated structure to put in place. Whereas we know that during the pandemic, a variety of entities have stood up different systems that are quite effective at rapidly getting financial assistance to individuals. And so I think that is an option that exists, whereas to do the program that flows to the providers, there is infrastructure we would need to be able to put in place to do that well over the long term. That does take a little bit longer to build, in part because we would want to have some stakeholder engagement around those systems to make sure they're accessible and don't create burdens for staff.
Yeah, I think it may be helpful to just, we have to find a way to explain that somehow. Maybe in some side-by-side chart, like here's the complexities here, this just something so we can have something a little bit more concrete.
That's a great idea. I like the side-by-side concept, Marika. And I think, the pieces that Sarah named, I think are real. I think that the other piece that I think has come up is around, and I guess you alluded to this, but the accountability side of it. We know that and not necessarily because people are being bad actors. Sometimes it's just because like everyone's drinking from a fire hose at this point. But when funds go to a program, that ensuring that it gets to the educators, in their pockets in the way that we know we want in terms of this program, is going to require more sort of careful work that is going to take some time. And the last thing we'd want to do is send money out the door that ends up not getting to its intended target. And again, I'm not suggesting people,
Yeah, and I think the other thing I would note about this is we are just now starting the rollout of the distribution of the childcare stabilization funds that are federal, which is going to be distributing a large amount of money directly to child development facilities as COVID relief. And I think there are some potential considerations if that money is going out to facilities at the same time as another pool of money that has different requirements are about how we minimize the burden for folks and ensure that we don't have issues with confusion about which funds are used for what purpose that actually end up not getting funds to staff or getting people in trouble with the different funding streams. That's the other consideration.
Yeah,
I'm
here.
Sorry, I feel like I lost the thread. Can you just remind me what the original question and statement was so I can make sure I'm following?
Being more explicit about the rationale for why direct educator is more suitable for a short term versus to program. And so as I'm hearing this conversation, I'm hearing all the elements. I feel like they're in both mechanisms. Accountability, that's true regardless of some procurement, that seems to be true regardless. Trust-based, that needs to be in place regardless. And I just want to underscore, I totally understand being responsible for public dollars, but something about using a deficit-based approach or deficit-based rationale feels somewhat uncomfortable to me. I just want to name that. I feel like trust needs to be in place regardless of which option we choose, as well as accountability. And so maybe there's some degree of trust, or maybe the risk is higher for one option versus another. But every time I'm hearing this conversation, it just seems like, yeah, all of those elements are true regardless of the mechanism. So just having a little bit more data about the degree variation might be helpful.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good point, Marika. And I do think we want to be really clear to ourselves first, and then obviously to the council and recommendations around what the factors are, and why one or another option makes more sense. So that's, I think an important note. And when we lay it all out, we can then do that assessment of, whether in fact it does feel as, that the differences are there in the way we've been talking about. Kathy, and then Christina, and then Marla.
I'm sorry, I'm sorry, just a note. And this idea that if we give the money to the programs, we're not sure that's going to go to providers. I do not know of, and perhaps my ignorance, I do not know of any examples of funding that was explicitly given to providers for their educators and monitored that did not result in the money going to providers, right? So I don't think the point is, I don't think we've ever tested a model where we provided funding to the providers, explicitly told them it was for compensation, and monitored it and determined that, wait a minute, the money didn't go to providers. I think we've done one versus the other. We've never done it together, but I may be wrong.
Yeah, I do know that there's some research on that, not in DC per se, but more broadly, that's been brought to my attention, that suggests that that has been an issue. And again, I want to be clear, it's not necessarily because people are being bad actors. It's because people are juggling a lot of information and funds and decisions, and that sometimes it ends up not landing where you want it to be. That said, I think these are all things that we do need to be really clear about and do our due diligence. And if we can't make, if the arguments aren't clear, then we shouldn't be making them. So I appreciate you raising all that. Kathy, Christina, Marla, Cynthia.
Yes, I am certainly in favor of a tiered payment opposed to a flat payment.
Anybody, can you hear me? I don't hear anything.
Oh, Christina,
Can you see this mic?
I think that we really, and I appreciate that not only is the educators credential and roles and responsibilities are honored in the tier system, but I'd like to know what went into the calculations.
Of what's in the tiers, yeah.
Of what's in the tiers, yeah. How did this calculation come about?
So essentially, it's a little bit of a backwards and forwards calculation, I would say, with, given that we have a limited pot of funds, we have some basic, data about where educators fall in terms of the roles and the credentials. And then we also have some information that gives us, oh, good. I'm glad you can hear us, Christina. That gives us, our sort of best guesses at where salaries are now versus what they might be in this new salary scale. And again, I would say that is very rough. So to be clear, because we don't have information or even close. And so it gets at something like, a scale of those differences. That said, Kathy, at some level, this is, these are arbitrary in terms of where the cutoffs are, and could they some of these numbers be a little higher and some of them be a little lower? Absolutely. Like it's not a perfect formula.
And if we hypothetically say we went with these figures and we dispersed direct to educator payments, would there be any money left to consider paying benefits or some portion toward benefits directly to programs, or it would be an all or nothing scenario? That it would be all to educators and then none to programs to cover benefits.
So are you saying, could we do both? Or are you saying if we do these dollars, would there be money left over?
With these dollars, would there be money left over to consider? I'm taking it that there would be none left over to consider.
The totally honest answer is, I think we don't know exactly, and so there could end up being some additional funds that were left, but this is assuming that in order to ensure that every educator who wanted to participate got their funds, that there probably would not be much left over.
So I just want to mention, I'm sorry about me losing my sound. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I do agree about the level of accountability. So, but with what you just presented, what we have on the screen, and with, either one, the flat or mostly the flat, we really don't need the salary scale to distribute this money if we do it a flat stipend, right? So that will go out the window.
So, right, so to be clear, again, I'm going to interrupt for 1 second, Christina, because I do think this is where it's really confusing, that you're absolutely right that the salary scale would be for the long-term option. So it wouldn't really work for the direct to educator in any kind of precise way. Like this attempts to get, like, sort of on average, you'd be getting, those additional supplemental wages in a way that somewhat is gonna, reflect what some of those changes would be in salary scale. But you're absolutely right that the salary scale is linked to the long-term program funds to program option.
And I remember in our conversations, I was very adamant, because to me, the risk of, like at least 90% of the people that work in this area work and have the city insurance, the DC Health Alliance, and losing their insurance for, because the $12,000, let's say we go with that, will actually put them in a different bracket. And I want to pair that with
hold on 1 second on the benefits clause issue, because we're definitely going to talk about that in just a few minutes.
Okay. No, but I just want to say that one thing that it just stuck in my mind last time we met in the committee was that, we need to be very practical. We don't want to lose the money. So what is the most equitable, practical way that we can distribute this money, but with the responsibility of really giving very clear recommendation of moving forward so people don't have those unintended consequences that we always talked about.
Yep, thank you,
That's it.
Christina. So Marla, Cynthia, Rakaya, and then I want to move on to one more question on this before we. Marla.
I just have a clarifying question. When we say direct to educator, are we saying that the check would go from ICE straight to the educator? Or are we saying that X number of dollars per educator would go to each center and then they would pay that amount to each educator? Because I thought in the conversation we had that ICE felt they had no capacity to pay educators directly.
Yeah, so OSSI would contract with someone to do that process.
And then they would have to collect payroll and all kind of stuff to be able to distribute those types of,
or not payroll, but right. They'd have to collect documentation and but it would not go through the programs. It would go directly to the educator from that contractor.
Okay. So I just, I don't know that makes a lot of sense to me. I don't think there's a lot of evidence that if this is widely advertised and people have to verify that they got their money, that there would be a real mechanism or a way that a program would not pay. I don't even think that that's the mindset of programs not wanting to pay. So I don't want that to be a prevention to why we don't do it that way, because that seems very complicated to hire someone to distribute these checks, for them to collect the documentation first that they need to do it when providers already have all of that to be able to do it. So that's my only point.
Thanks, Marla. Cynthia, Rakaya.
I thought mainly that when some of us had already met, we had a consensus based on that if OSSI's saying that they don't have the capacity, that we can hire a human resource place or a company that already knows the work, know how to gather the information, know how to report, also can report back to some people when they're having difficulties of receiving payment or tracking payment, that they can track that information just as well. If OSSI is saying that they don't have the resource to do that, we should make sure that we can opt out of having OSSI. OSSI doesn't have to take the burden of every single piece, even though they have the information, but they can provide that information just as well to a human resource agency. I'm quite sure they have the data to be able to do that. And also, when we're thinking at the BA level, I just want to make sure that these funds, that they come out to anyone, that just because a director in the program is labeled in family child care as a director does not mean they're not the lead teacher, or they doesn't have a BA degree or whatever that is. So I just wanted to make sure I got that. So get some understanding there when we break that down.
Yeah, no, in that case, yes, the lead teacher absolutely would be, also that director role. But yes, the child development home folks would absolutely get that.
Cynthia, I thought when we were talking about that, we were talking about the long-term mechanism for distributing funds to take it from OSSI to a third party rather than this short-term mechanism. So maybe I missed that. I thought we were trying to make it as seamless and as possible, because you would need to stand up a third party to do that. It would take some time to do all of that. Where I can see an easier way of just saying, okay, everyone gets $12,000. I know there's some conversation about, tier or not tier, but just saying on average, $12,000, and then you could really, 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 and then you could really, distribute that fairly easily to your colleagues, to your staff?
I guess what I was thinking more that ECE, I guess they have that per business, and maybe if they're doing it per business, that may be easy for ECE to do. But I'm not sure if ECE has it per staff or per employee that's within that business. If they have all the data, then I guess the more the merrier if they have that. But I was just thinking that I was thinking both ways, short or long term. If ECE is saying they don't have the capacity, but they still have the data of what that is, then whomever is specialized in human resources, who has the credentials or whatever, that they can do it just as well. I don't know. I maybe confused myself, but I was thinking both terms and not short or long, but I guess whichever works best to get the money into providers' hands.
Thanks. Rakaya.
Because I've had a lot of conversations with a variety of either program directors or educators themselves about this issue, I just want to kind of raise what has come out in those conversations, and want to also encourage, there's several program directors and on this line, and so I would like for them to either corroborate what I'm saying or contradict what I'm saying so that I make sure I'm speaking about this correctly. But what I have heard, I think folks felt very comfortable with, like, I think folks at the director level really were interested in the long term doing a direct to provider approach, but in the short term, folks seemed comfortable with and didn't really flinch at the idea, or and in some ways, some folks were preferring the idea of the direct to individual. And I think it was just around, I think it was especially smaller programs were concerned about the administrative burden because of all the various grants. But I think there was some variation, I will say, but that was kind of what I took away from those conversations, and I encourage folks to step in to add your perspective. And then the other thing that we heard from educators was, I think across the board, educators were really interested in a direct to individual, both in the short term and the long term, because I think there's a need for a lot of improvement in the way that we make sure that staff is hearing about some of the information and their the things that they're entitled to and things like that. And I think there's just a real desire from teachers themselves for accountability and transparency that I think is important for us to think about building into the long-term program. But all that's to say, I think in those conversations where we've had a variety of folks at the table, there was a comfort level with a short-term direct to individual and a long-term direct to provider. But some of the folks on this call may have, our directors themselves and may be able to lend more color to that. And maybe I'm misrepresenting.
Thanks, Rakaya. And again, I hope that some of what we will be able to hear on Saturday from educators, from directors, from various stakeholders can speak to some of this and get people's perspectives on how they view that, what people's preferences are and why, so that we can have a more informed sense about all of that. We are close to out of time, and I want to at least just preview what's in the remaining slides, and you all can look at this on your own time as well. But I wanted to just flag it because I want people to start thinking. So there's one question and one of you brought up something related to this. But again, if we were to do a direct educator approach, this wouldn't really apply for the program level because the sort of prorating kind of would be built in, because however many hours you're working, your salary, your salary is reflecting that. But for a direct to educator, there would need to be a question about what the standard for eligibility should be. I guess it was Taryn who raised this question. If you work part-time, if you've only worked part of the year, it adds a level. So if people have thoughts about that, I would welcome those. And then I want to just preview some of these next steps. We've talked about them a little bit, but just so that you all know what's coming. And again, this is in thinking about a program level funding mechanism, what we have been talking about in terms of the longer term, recognizing that we've raised some questions tonight about that. So so OSSI is working on developing some modeling tools that will help us think about this formula that, Marika was talking about, and how, how such a program would impact bottom lines of facilities, and what some of the costs would be, including, administration costs, what kind of technical assistance. So sort of laying out some of that. We are going to schedule some options for reviewing at least the like baby versions of those models late next week and early the following week. So I'll send out some meeting invites to folks, and I'll probably do what we did with the funding mechanisms. I'll make a couple of options so that you just choose one, and that way we can get more people, who can accommodate more schedules. So I think that will help us again with this like intersectional conversation we're trying to have to see like what would this look like, and then be able to kind of pressure test. I also want to just point to these couple of slides that are about the benefit cliffs issue. We've talked about it a lot, and we are now starting to dig into some of the data to really get a handle on like, what does this look like? Big thank you to Marla for connecting us with DHS. We've got some conversations that are starting there, which I'm hoping will be really helpful. Big thanks to Rakaya, who did a better job of reading the fine print for the Atlanta Fed calculator and actually found the part that does in fact work for DC. The link is here. If you're a data person, I warn you, don't start this late at night because you will spend hours on it. It's a little addictive. But the bottom line here is, all sort of joking aside, the benefit cliffs issue, in fact, like it's something we really, really, really need to look at. And I know we've said that, but we're starting to put some, kind of concrete examples around it. And what you see here are two different examples where in both cases, the educator would end up worse off, at least on paper, financially, after getting this, significant bump in wages than at the beginning. But just to underscore how individualized the situation is, if you, in these scenarios, if you simply changed how many children each of these educators had, you just swapped it, then the opposite would be true. Then their starting point, they would be at a much better place after that raise than they were at the beginning. So all of this to say it's complicated, and this is just DC. We've got a lot of educators who live in Maryland and Virginia, and so their benefit situations are different because of that. So we've got some next steps on continue to dig into that data, but just so you know, that is something that Sarah and team are thinking about, like as we think about what some of these levels and formulas look like, to try and figure out if we can get a sense of the scope of the problem. There are going to be a lot of people for whom this is not an issue at all, but there are certainly going to be people for whom it is, and we want to do what we can to sort of preempt and think about possible solutions. And then this is just from that cool tool, so I'm not going to go through it, but you guys can spend time. So look out for calendar invites for those the models conversation. I look forward to seeing folks on Saturday, and hopefully getting a chance to hear from a lot of stakeholders about some of these questions that we've been talking about. If you are not going to be able to attend, but there are particular questions that you would like to make sure that we ask, please just send them my way and we'll make sure we include those. And again, if you haven't already, just drop me a quick note as to whether you are able to attend and for how long, so we can plan for that.
I don't want to keep other people, so I know we're about to adjourn, but yeah, the benefits cliff issue is so very real, as you just gave a little bit. So I really want us to figure out a way to provide health insurance for employees. Like that, just to lose your health insurance in this process is to put people in a worse situation than we found them. Because they're one catastrophic event from, just bankruptcy. So I'm glad you gave some examples, but that's why I've been keep saying, the benefits cliff, we got to keep that in mind because it's very real.
Yeah, it's very real. And, there's there's, for one thing, there's there's healthcare, there are other benefits too. So SNAP is actually one that seems like it's going to come up, to some significant degree. And on the healthcare front, I want to, again, note, so Sarah has been having some conversations with folks at, DC HealthLink to understand what some of the options can be to try and, because independent of what we're doing on this wages thing, we should be doing that, right? Like it's just an important issue for all of our small businesses. And it's, important for us to remember that this is not a childcare specific issue. It's a much broader issue. And so some of the solutions are probably going to, be broader solutions too, and thinking about like, what are the different ways in which we're leveraging the, the healthcare marketplace and some of the benefits that I think, and again, not just in childcare, that a lot of small businesses may not even be leveraging that they could, so there's no matter what, there's work that needs to happen on it. But certainly the added pressure of getting more money and having that result in the loss of benefits is huge. So
can I add just one little thing? The other risk, that a lot of the residents of DC who qualify for the DC Health Alliance, they don't need to have a Social Security to actually have that benefits. But on the contrary, if the company is providing this health insurance, oftentimes some health insurance will not work that way. That is just for DC, that is, a sanctuary city that provides that service. So we want to keep that in mind when we're making decisions also about health insurance. Because to me, it's a human right.
Yep. Well, thank you all. Again, I know that, we have not, we don't always resolve all the questions, but please do keep this conversation going, continue to share, thoughts and reactions to anything, that we touched on tonight or other things, so that we can continue building that into our work moving forward. I will see many of you on Saturday. Look forward to that. And we'll send out those calendar invites shortly as well. Thanks all.
Can I make one announcement?
Yeah.
Doing this on the issue of health benefits. We are in open enrollment season for DC HealthLink. So if there are providers y'all are aware of who may be looking to access healthcare, there are a number of increased subsidies available through DC HealthLink currently because of the American Rescue Plan. So if folks are struggling to get information on that, send them to us. We can connect them to folks at DC HealthLink. We're able to work with them to have some of their, can't remember what they're called, they're like navigators, assisters, help people through this process. There are also ways they can work with small businesses that may take longer, but because the open enrollment period only goes through January 31st, we do want to raise awareness of this now and encourage people to think about it and explore it. There are even people who went on last year or 2 years ago and found it too expensive because of the changes with the American Rescue Plan. It may be a much better deal right now. We really want to encourage people to look at it. So sorry for that PSA. I do think as we think about this, since the open enrollment period is time bound, it may be really important right now to encourage some people to look at this option in a way that we might not have been thinking about previously.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes. And I really urge you all to get that information out to everyone you possibly can. All right. Take care all. Have a good night.
Have a good one, everybody.